You're tuned in to the Stingbat Radio Network on FM 101.2 KRPG. Welcome to Dungeon Master Diaries, a podcast about Shadowdark and other role-playing games where two GMs talk about their recent experiences at the table and hopefully give you something useful that you can take to yours. On the show today, we discuss combat house rules. Hello there, sages and adventurers. My name is Matt, and with me, as always, is my good friend and GM colleague, Jody. How you doing?
Man, do you want to fight? Let's fight. No, that's a terrible segue, but I just went with
you. Yeah, indeed you did. And that's staying in. Today's episode focuses on our house rules we use for combat, death, and dying. I didn't see there was a comma there, Jody. So if you would, get us out of this intro so we don't have to do this anymore and take us to the table.
Alrighty. If you would, join me. It's a dark night. On a road, torchlight guides your way. Ahead of you looms the comforting sight of the walls of a medieval town. Safety as you return from your day's adventure. You're tired, you're battered. It's nice to get back. A warm meal awaits. Your thief and your rangers, bows and crossbows, badly splintered from misuse or overuse. The poor bard's barely limping in, hanging on with, you know as a player, just one hit point. And so exhausted. The priest, they're dealing with a little bit of an existential crisis over there, trying to regain a holy connection that was severed in the dungeons they just left. Their god has abandoned them. But the walls lay ahead. Rest, respite, nothing a few coin can't solve. That's the scene. Man, wouldn't it be cool if any of that mattered? Like if any of that was real? So here's the thing. Shadowdark is one heck of a toolkit. You can do all kinds of things with it. And what I wanted, to a degree, was for that scene to be real and matter.
All right, Jody, that is a scene that, as I'm thinking about it, resonates personally.
Well,
how dare you? How dare you? But I hear what you're saying. You want that feeling of being bruised, battered, your weapons messed up from use. You're just really limping into town, hopefully weighed down by treasure. But you know that is arguably one of the things that's hardest to do about in any role-playing game, at least ones where that's the fantasy. So give us a sense of we're talking about house rules. That's kind of the top line of the episode. So where's the intersection between those two things?
Yeah, so any rule system is going to have its combat rules and how to do things, and it's going to have its rest and recovery rules. Oftentimes, it just becomes very hand-wavy about those issues, those like the hardship of dungeon exploration and adventuring. As I said in the kind of taking us to the table moment there of Shadowdark's a great toolkit. Like you can get it to do what you need it to do. And so I wanted that to happen, you know, and through various iterations, Matt, you and I have looked at like injury rules and different injury tables and called shots and what would fumbles look like. And what we've kind of arrived at is a distillation of those things. And the reason I love these house rules that we use is because they create a mechanical reality that is this hardship that these adventurers have experienced. And it's funny that the combat rules are where this all lives. It's a byproduct. It isn't combat rules for the sake of wanting combat to work differently. In fact, it's probably the thing I would be the most hesitant to change for its own sake is how combat plays out in Shadowdark. I love how quick it is, how clean it is. It's very simple. But by tacking on a few extra things, it's created these down the road scenarios where the adventurers want to get back to town. dare I say, need to get back to town. Our combat house rules are really the way that I see a bridge between this satisfying death combat, taking a toll, being high stakes, beyond just your character dies, which has value all its own that we'll probably talk about in the future, but in a more tangible sense starts taxing other resources, starts making you feel the need to get back and deal with things. To kind of get some specificity on this ramble of what I wanted to talk about and what I wanted to share with folks, and then really want to hear what other folks are adding into the Shadow Dark soup, is this idea of some specific house rules that we've introduced into our games, and we've continued to iterate on these, change these, make additions and deletions, but for now, just 3 that we're using. So first off, fumbles in combat. We have an exhaustion mechanic we use that you came up with that I really like it. It's a great addition to the game. Factor in. And then how do we rule death and dying? Because we have tweaked the death and dying rules a little bit. I'm going to take them, just start off and rattle down the list. First off, fumbles in combat. Now, there's already rules if you're a caster and you cast a spell and you roll a natural 1 and you don't have a luck token to get you out of it. You're going to have to deal with miscasts and penance, and you lose the spell and all of those kind of wonderful and horrible things. So those stakes are very real if you're a caster and you're rolling and you roll that natural 1. What about for combatants? What about your swinging your sword or your axe? And because you can, as long as you keep succeeding, you get to keep casting the spell. There isn't that difference of a spell slot system where you don't want to penalize the sword swinger because they swing their sword a lot. So what we've introduced and settled on is if you make a melee or ranged attack and you roll a natural 1, the weapon you're using suffers a permanent -1 to its damage output. We do cap that at you will always do 1 damage. And this is cumulative like a talent. So that was that one. And the fix is what's interesting about this rule, I think. So fumbles in combat, -1 to damage, pretty straightforward. I'm going to jump to death and dying. I did these in a different order at the top. But death and dying, we use, instead of rolling a timer die or anything like that, it's 1 plus your constitution bonus. That's your dying timer. In addition to that, if you go to 0 or fewer hit points, you suffer an exhaustion. Exhaustion is very simple. You just fill in one of your gear slots with the word exhaustion, and you cannot clear that until you take downtime, whatever that looks like in your set of rules. You take downtime, you clear your exhaustions. Until then, you fill up a gear slot. Now, what if your gear slots are all full? Well, then you drop a piece of gear because you are too tired from your battered ordeal. So if you have a cleric in your party, if you have a priest in your party, I don't know why anybody would call it a cleric. It's clearly a priest. If you have a priest in your party, you can have people drop into 0 and popping back up and drop into 0 and popping back up, and they might have a whole stack of exhaustion in their backpack. So that's it. It was only 3, kind of short and sweet there, but those 3 all share the unifying idea of you're going to have to deal with these when you go back to town. You're going to have to buy new gear. You're going to have to take some downtime to clear that exhaustion. And the nice thing about these, I feel like, is none of them require really much in the way of overhead or additional rules consideration from the GM or the player. It's very quick. It's very in keeping with the core style of mechanics. So that's the 3. I've really enjoyed using these. I've enjoyed as a player feeling those bumps and bruises. Man, you roll a couple minuses to hit or minuses to damage, you really start resenting that weapon and you are keen to go find a new one. Also, it gets out of the habit of my fighter only wields their preferred weapon because, well, they're starting to ding up their preferred weapon and maybe they can find another one.
For me, I'm going to take it in the same order that you did. So we'll start with the fumbles in combat. I love the -1 damage to weapons. However, on a fumble, ranged weapons target a random combatant.
Mm-hmm.
And some context for that was that we had people with longbows standing in hallways shooting past their entire party sometimes.
Yeah.
And into combat. That fantasy is totally reasonable and cool and awesome. But in the context of what we were doing, which is exclusively dungeon crawling, it did feel a little bit like there was no downside
Right.
Like, why wouldn't you especially, and this was true of thieves too, like, why wouldn't you as a thief just take a short bow and kind of hide in the back of the party and try and get off that first volley of a sneak attack? There are very few styles of play that are mechanically degenerate in Shadowdark. Shadowdark does a great job of discouraging people from doing degenerate things mechanically. There are, of course, degenerate players who cannot be stopped and should be excommunicated from tables. Take your murder hoboism elsewhere.
What do you mean when you say a degenerate mechanic?
What I mean by a degenerate mechanic, thank you for the prompt, is something that it is a rule or mechanic in the game that encourages a style of play that is non-interactive in this case, meaning that as a thief, in the kind of parlance of Dungeons and Dragons, you standing in the back of the party kind of peeking out, that's not really what kind of the core fantasy of a thief is, insofar as you're only doing it because the mechanics of the game are pushing you in that direction.
Right.
So if you're doing that because that's what your character is interested in doing, that's great, but you shouldn't be doing that because that's the path of least resistance in the rules.
Right. It feels overtly gamey, not narrative.
Yes. And so I have no problem with a thief that does that, by the way. I like a thief that just hangs in the back with a crossbow because I, as a player, get to yell at them for not going up front and finding all the traps. That's a fun role-playing, interaction. It's a fun kind of thing to do as a thief, is to kind of is to play in alternative thiefy kind of ways. But you shouldn't necessarily, in my opinion, be doing that because that's the path of least resistance and that's the way to do the most damage, et cetera, et cetera. So here's my question to you. When you're running the game, which one of these rules feels completely and utterly like it was a part of the rules from the beginning? Like, do all of them? But like we very quickly house ruled in these three things. Some of them have changed slightly. Do any of them feel like kind of inseparable now?
Yeah, it would be strange for me to remove fumbles entirely. It feels strange that if you roll a 20, something happens, but if you roll a 1, nothing happens.
Sure.
That's always been kind of my, and I mean, you can go back to the 70s and the same statement was made as I think one of the earliest formalized adopted house rules for all of D20 fantasy RPGs was criticals. Well, then there ought to be fumbles, right? And I swing mentally that way. So that one of the three is first on the list of like, man, it would be really weird to play without some sort of something, especially since there is something when you cast a spell. It feels very strange but the rest of the time it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think one thing about fumbles that I think people get a little hung up on, and one thing I do not like, I'm going to plant my flag here, I don't like fumble tables. I find them to be shoehorned in at best because, and look, if you're a Dungeon Crawl Classics fan, I mean, rock on with your bad self. Because
it's also a slightly different animal.
Yes. And if you like fumble tables, rock on. But I would not want to play in a game with a fumble table because it can cause me to feel like my choice was taken from me and made into something that now we have to like backwards design narrative for. I don't like them. What I do like is a very simple, transparent mechanic. This is going to become a theme of this show, I suppose. But I like the transparency of this mechanic. As a player, it's not like when you roll a one of 20 things or one of 100 things is going to happen. The exact same thing is going to happen every single time. And it feels okay. Like you know ahead of time. It's not overly punishing. It 100% kind of quote unquote makes sense, right? Insofar as any of the crap we're doing at the table makes sense. But I like that about our fumble rule. And I like that about other simple fumble rules. There's plenty more other fumble rules. It's also worth noting that we don't really use fumbles for monsters and NPCs in the same way. I, on a natural one, will improvise a fumble for an NPC.
Mm-hmm.
It might be the same thing, but what I like to do is that's where I would feel more comfortable using a table to decide what happens, because it's an NPC. They don't ultimately matter. The player characters matter because they are player characters. So that's why I don't like fussing with them. I like the idea of improvisational or table-based fumbles when it comes to NPCs, because then the players get to scream and cheer at like the crazy thing that happened, and that's fun. And that leads me to a question that I want to ask you about all of these house rules, which is, how does it feel to be a player? You like them, but I want to get a sense of, have you had any players push back on them? Have you had any players, describe them as like kind of feel sad or in any other kind of have any other negative reaction to them?
Yes. But only of earlier iterations that we did. We had other versions of these that I have let those brain cells go. They were subject to the brown water gods. But my wife and daughter both said, coming specifically from kind of high fantasy backgrounds, if you will, some 5e, especially my daughter really enjoys 5e D&D. And both of them initially with Shadow Dark were like, holy cow, these characters are fragile. And by comparison, absolutely they are. So anything that felt punitive in that way, that it was making it harder for them to keep their character alive, those were the ones that got comments about like, man, I don't like how this sits. This feels unfair. This feels not okay. It's hard. The phrase I got was, it's hard enough,
Right.
And in your first 3 levels as a Shadow Dark character, when a single high damage attack can put you down, it's hard enough, right? Like it can be tough. Since then, this current lineup of rules that we just went through, both of them have had the same response of, no, that feels like it makes sense. That feels they didn't say it feels fair, but they go, no, that feels in keeping with the rules. That feels, it sucks, but it's reasonable. So, and as a GM, when I put on my GM hat, I go, but that's what I want. Like that's where I want to be, of like firm but fair, for lack of any better phrasing, is the like, no, okay, I get it. Yeah, I get why that. And again, I think why it's that way is that opening narrative is we're already doing that as players in our head. We are already seeing that story. When my PC drops down to 1 or 2 hit points, I'm like, oh man, they're all banged up and they're tired and they're gasping. Like I have that story in my mind. When I'm seeing, as a GM, seeing my party and I know somebody's really beat up, I am imagining that character, even if the player's not hamming it up that way. I'm like, oh man, they're pretty beat up. And my NPC, same deal. So it's nice to have something tangible that hangs on there. The other piece I will say is none of these impede the flow of the game.
That's kind of where I wanted to go next. And before we do, I want to just go back to something I said, which is that I don't like fumble tables. I like them for Magic. I want to be very clear about this because Magic is something completely different.
Right.
It is meant to be wild and crazy. Fumble tables for Magic. Great job, Kelsey. Well done. Don't at us, anybody.
You're tapping into the unknown there.
I know.
Right?
I could just feel a little burning, sort of on the on the back of my skull. But here is where I wanted to kind of take this conversation, which is that, I want to point out exhaustion, which, in my estimation, is the rule that for me feels like it is inseparable from the rules. I would almost certainly be unwilling to play without this, even as a player, because going to 0 hit points and not dying is, if you have a priest in your party, relatively common insofar as you haven't house ruled some other way to die easier, or you're not playing with the like instant death on 0 hit points and stuff like that. So all that aside, popping back up from 0 hit points isn't uncommon. Right. It does happen with some relative frequency. And the thing I like about exhaustion is twofold. Number one, it's very simple and doesn't take any time at the table really to adjudicate, and often doesn't even happen when the player is taking their turn. They can, if they need to choose a slot to sacrifice with an item in it, they can do it on another player's turn. Number two, it has a creeping sensation of building up, and we have ruled that it only goes away when you have an extended amount of downtime, not just a simple rest.
Right.
You need to have, for us, it's a week, but I think in some games, people play fast and loose with what downtime is. I would, if you're thinking about using this in your game, or if I was going to run a game where it wasn't necessarily preordained what rests, how long rests were, I would keep this downtime requirement. I love the fact that simply going to bed at night isn't enough. These are wounds, or they are it's a level of trial and tribulation that you have been through that only an extended amount of rest will get you back from.
Right. And in the narrative parlance, and I mean, you can do this all day of like, well, here's the narrative of why for any mechanic. Yes. So I am aware that this is kind of a straw man argument. But if you think about hit points as hit protection, and that's the kind of mindset you take with your hit points, and I think that is a healthy mindset to take as a player, frankly, of, that like, oh, I'm down 4 hit points out of my 8, so therefore I should run away because No, you're still a hero. Go be a hero. To the delight and glee of everybody who watches you die gloriously. But your character's hurt, but are you injured? And I don't, just like you were saying, like, I don't want to go into random fumble tables. As a Warhammer Fantasy roleplay character or player of yore and GM that had the infamous both critical and hit location critical tables that were really enjoyable and fun, man, do they slow the game down. Those injuries to find out, oh, you lost your pinky on your left hand. That granularity, if that's your bag, great. But I'm kind of like, hey, this isn't interesting that you've tuned into a Shadow Darky podcast. Good on you, because that's not in keeping with Shadow Dark's vibes. But there should still be something that is a tissue injury, something that is a like, yeah, I turned my ankle and I can't just walk this off. My rib is cracked and I'm going to need some downtime. I do want to throw as a little asterisk on this. You can still go carousing. Well, you have exhaustion and clear exhaustion. That R&R is good for the body and the mind, hopefully. Right. That downtime of extended time that also ties kind of neatly into carousing. But if you were real savvy and you wanted to maybe adapt your carousing table, maybe a low carousing roll says don't clear exhaustion. You could have something like that. That's like, hey, you partied a little too hard, friendo. Also, the other thing, because exhaustion was my very close number 2 on the like which one feels really at home in this system and that you'd have a hard time letting go of. Exhaustion would absolutely be it was splitting hairs. My old school, I think, is showing in the fumble table love, or the fumble result love. But it's that narrative piece with exhaustion that there's an actual injury there that has meaning and cost, and it creates a really interesting mechanical space of there's this new currency, this negative currency, if you will, has entered the game, along with torches, literally in your backpack, along with your rations in your backpack. I could see a reality in which exhaustion shows up in other places. I think in one of our other episodes, we mentioned that we sometimes use a traveling table that we just roll on it because we want to just get to the dungeon. We have a Sunday group that just exclusively does dungeon crawling, and that's all that happens in those game sessions. But you still got to travel to the location, so we roll on a table. Some of those results will ding you with an exhaustion. You go into the dungeon because you're tired, because you had a lousy night camping, because on the travel, because you're tired. So everybody's got one less gear slot today. And that's, to me, the Shadow Dark toolkit. Like, how do you think about the things you want to add and take away from the game? To me, that's my North Star right now. Does it feel just as clean, simple, and intuitive as all the other rules do? To that point, that's kind of why we tweak the death and dying and moved away from a timer die, is because that's a unique standout spot. And so we went, well, so let's just have it be a fixed thing with the Constitution bonus. So, that one's pretty minor. I'll be of the three, I could take or leave that one. Like it's a coin flip on any given day, but I like the consistency, and it reads under the what's the bottom line test. The bottom line test is it's no more or less intuitive than everything else that Kelsey created in this really, really streamlined toolkit. So yeah, exhaustion for me is I would be sad to see it go, just because then if you've got a high level priest, man, you can drop 3 or 4 times in one fight and it didn't matter. After the fight, you're at full strength again, as long as you got a couple luck tokens rattling around.
Yeah, and especially because when we're talking about it, what I don't like doing is adjusting my GMing to be more punitive just because players are doing things tactically that also make sense narratively. So I talked about the fact that I'm not a fan of people taking the path of least resistance that the rules offer, and then kind of like backwards engineering a narrative to support what is very clearly just a mechanically degenerate thing to do, which some games are purely like, Pathfinder's like literally built for people to be able to play in an optimization style way. And that's not seen as degenerate. And I in those systems, more power to you. But I don't want to go down that rabbit hole again. What I want to do is say what I think is important about all three of these house rules, but exhaustion specifically, is that you talked about them taxing players. They tax players in a way that doesn't feel punitive because they can see it coming. They can work to make better decisions. But they tax players even when you have, for instance, a high-level priest. These are taxes that will persist into higher-level games. And like you said, like if you have a high-level priest, you can keep pinging people with heals. I don't want, as a GM, to become more punitive as players get more powerful.
Yeah.
I want to run the game the way that I run the game. I don't want my monsters to suddenly be like, oh, there's a level 6 priest over there. Well, now I'm going to take my second attack and just kill this person who I just brought to 0 hit points or whatever it is.
Right.
I'm going to run the game the way I run the game. And that might be more or less punishing or more or less deadly than any other GM. But I don't want to have to change the way I run the game just because my players get higher level. I'm going to play the monsters the way that I'm going to play the monsters, whether the everybody's level 1 or level 6. If they run into a Wraith, that Wraith's going to mess up a level 1 gang, and it's probably going to be much easier for a level 6 gang.
Yeah.
That's the way it's going to be.
Yeah.
And what I like about these rules is that they offer a meaningful tax to every level of character. Obviously, the tax gets less relevant, but it's still very relevant. And I don't have to keep changing the way that I run the game just to accommodate or artificially punish higher level characters. Then I start feeling like that's what I was doing in 5th edition. I was creating encounters that were balanced around the character level. That's not really what I want to be doing. Right. And I certainly don't want to quote unquote balance encounters by changing the way that I think about tactically running monsters or run monsters in a way that's more tactical than maybe they should narratively be played just because there's this priest that's going to get people up from the
it's leaning so hard into that adversarial relationship.
Yeah.
Which is why even though all three of these rules are punitive, they also don't feel adversarial. They are byproducts of the situation, and they don't prevent the player from doing something cool and heroic. Not only do they not incentivize continued gaminess or degenerate mechanical play, but they also still allow you to continue to be just as cool as you ever were. You did drop to 0 hit points and you get up now. You're not dealing with some weird lingering thing and you're disadvantaged on. No. You're back up. You write in this line that you have an exhaustion there, but take your turn. Go be the hero.
You don't suffer a minus to your attack, modifier, your strength or your dex modifier. Like some, fumble tables will actually make you a less qualified hero. Right. That stuff drives me bananas.
Yeah. And so it's like, it still encourages you to, like I said, get up and get back in the fight, and it also creates some interesting space that the aforementioned stab crossbow that was broken all to heck. Hey, at what point do you just say enough is enough and you grab a dagger? As a weird byproduct of play, one of my characters went off and wanted to purchase a really excellent top end bow. And I will tell you that the fumble rule literally made me go, oh yeah, you can go find a bow with a +1 to hit, a master crafted bow, if you will. Definitely. It's not magic. It's not impervious. It's just a bow that gives you a +1 to hit. It's pretty awesome. It's very expensive. Don't roll a 1 because now it's just a bow forever. Like, good luck finding anybody that can go fix this perfect example of a, so it also created some fun new thought space, some fun spaces to engage with. Again, that's why in a weird way, it's not so much this episode. I didn't so much want to be like, hey, everybody, here's our cool rules and feel great about them. And like, I hope you do. And if we're missing something and you've got a great suggestion or for us of like, hey, have you tried this or that? Hey, make our game better. Yes, please. And hopefully you can do the same with what we've given you on these. But there was also a thought structure that Matt and I have kind of explored with this of what feels appropriate to Shadow Dark, what feels appropriate to this game mechanically that still lets the game be great in the way it is. And I'll tell you what, the one thing that I would never sacrifice, having run a bunch, we talked a bit about this after one of these recent sessions, was the speed of combat. So anything that would add in a combat house rule that would slow down combat much at all, man, I'm going to have a hard time accepting that one. Kind of the oft discussed online. What about giving an extra attack? Anymore, I'm actually not concerned about the extra attack from a power level. I'm concerned because it sounds silly. It'll slow the game down. It's one more die roll to calculate on that person's turn. And I'm just not interested in doing that. I ran our heroes took on an entire air quotes pirate ship with crew, and they fought the whole crew. And we were able to snap through those turns really quickly, even with fumbles occurring and missed shots dealing damage to allies and exhaustion being applied, and never slowed down combat at all. We were able to fly around the table and get through a lot of rounds of combat very quickly. So that thought space of what for you at your table is Shadow Dark's like, man, this is what I want this system to be. Now, if you want all that complexity and you grit, and you want those tables and you want those things, man, more power to you. This system that's the beauty of it, right? Is that it'll be like, yeah, throw it on here and you're good to go, right? It'll still, but for me at my table, and I feel comfortable for you at your table, man, that speed that you can get around the table in a combat and you get, what do you do? What do you do? What do you do? Okay, this is what the bad guys do. Now, what do you do? What do you do? And it's not a whole lot slower than that is really satisfying. So, it's that kind of, what are your goals? What are your wish lists? What are your wants? That I wanted to bring this as an episode for folks to listen to and engage with and at us and think about, those holy grails for you of when it comes to combat. What do you want from your table?
Dungeon Master Diaries is brought to you by the folks at Me Dungeons. The underwear that crawls through cracks and not up yours. These underwear will keep up with you if you're being chased by rabid ghouls through the halls of the Barrow Maze, or if you're running from a crookhorn under the eaves of the Dolmen Wood. No chafing, no problems. Perhaps you were thrown into the arena to face off in a battle to the death against a hulking pit fighter. Well, all that sand and dirt would be a recipe for disaster for your down belows if you were wearing anything other than Me Dungeons. Don't be that guy who forces the party to turn back just before the good treasure because your nethers are redder than a troll's arse. If you're ready to take your adventuring underwear to the next level, use the code Dungeon Master Diaries at checkout to get a new limited edition pair of underwear absolutely free. Remember, you don't want to get caught with your pants down unless you're wearing me dungies. All right, Jody, let's hop into our last segment where we kind of distill a couple of things each that we think are core takeaways of this episode. So why don't you start us off with your first one?
I'm going to quote Uncle Adam from Tabletop Minions. So if you don't know, it's a tabletop wargaming YouTuber. Vibes aren't rules. That's a indirect quote. And I'm going to say with your role-playing games, though, let the vibes, let the narrative guide your rules decisions, right? That what's the story you want to embrace? And that's why at the top, when I was setting the context for things, I told that story of our beleaguered heroes returning to the city by torchlight, anxious to get some rest and repair their weapons. Because that narrative, that story, I wanted that. That's why did I want people to get banged up in combat? Because I wanted that story to be real. So how do you create rules that will get you that vibe, that will get you that narrative? Let the narrative guide you, not the other way around.
So my first one is to consider the player perspective. And I think all too often GMs will house rule stuff because, and I even sort of alluded to this or I guess I was pretty explicit about it, because they don't want a particular play style or they don't like something in a particular rule set. And those are all legitimate reasons. Those are and there are lots of legitimate reasons to house rule stuff, but I think the best way to make sure a house rule is successful and received well is to consider what it will feel like from the player perspective to interact with it. What is it going to feel like in a moment, a combat, to roll a natural one and have your weapon do -1 damage, right? It's obviously not going to feel great, but put yourself in the shoes of a player who is at the table in a moment where they are very invested in the game, and then think about what your house rule is going to do especially if it denies them the ability to do something in that moment where they're highly invested in the game.
Yeah, no fun for you is never a great feeling. My last one here is that thing I kind of closed the earlier discussion out with, which was, what is it that you and your table, to piggyback off what Matt just said, what is it that you and your table want from Shadowdark? What do you want your game to be? If you're going to stick a homebrew rule in there, how is that serving that system? What is it adding or taking away from that system that you really want? And don't forget, sometimes you can home rule by getting out the big black Sharpie and just deleting stuff. This isn't a thing anymore. We're not going to do that. That's fine too. But always keep in mind that, like, hey, where am I going? What am I trying to achieve?
And finally, for me, we've talked a lot about the stuff to consider. But I just want to say kind of out loud the what I think is the important part. I think, Jody, you'll agree,
100%.
which is try stuff, iterate, change it when it doesn't work. The worst thing to do is not to try things that could potentially make your game more fun for you and your players. The other biggest sin of house rules is to just keep them around because that's just how you play. If they're not working, change them. And especially talk to your players about house rules. And if you get 4 or 5 sessions into your campaign and you realize that, man, this rule isn't really working, change it. And obviously, the same goes for any rule in any role-playing game ever. That's the beauty, right, of our wonderful hobby here, Jody, is that we can rip stuff apart, change stuff, and the permission structure is there, unlike in other formats and unlike in other disciplines.
You bought the game. It's yours. Do what you want.
Do what you want.
All right, friends, as the torchlight grows dim, we hope you were able to find something useful in our discussion today that you can take into your future game. If you have any questions or unique experiences from your table that you'd like us to discuss in a future episode, head over to the Dungeon Master Diaries thread on the Shadowdark Discord channel. Look for links to any materials we referenced in this episode in that thread or in our show notes. If you'd like to reach out to us directly, you can find Jody on the Shadowdark Facebook page under the handle Pezman, and you can message Matt via Discord using the handle SCMatt. Until next time, make it your own.
Dungeon Master Diaries is a production of the Stingbat Radio Network. It is produced by Jody Kropholler and edited by Matt Bruner. Our intro and outro music is composed by Christian Schuster. Dungeon Master Diaries is an independent production and not affiliated with the Arcane Library, LLC. Shadow Dark is a product of the Arcane Library. Copyright 2023.